In recent years, Japanese special effects films have been making an effort towards the adoption of computer-generated imagery. Granted, we've seen bits and pieces long ago with movies like Gamera 3 and Death Note, but the successes of Shin Godzilla and Shin Ultraman have become cases where the capabilities of CGI within a Japanese production is starting to push its limits. So much that Godzilla Minus One would win an Academy Award for Best Visual Effects. However, this has also been a point of concern amongst the fandom. Gradually, we are seeing the use of practical miniatures and set pieces be swapped out with digital. And this brings me to a big question. Is Tokusatsu dying? No, it isn't. Allow me to explain. For starters, if you're watching this video, then I would assume you already have an understanding of what Tokusatsu is, as well as its importance when it comes to shaping Japanese pop culture. For those who don't, it's a term used to describe live-action special effects film and TV productions made popular by Eiji Tsuburaya, special effects director of many of the Showa Godzilla movies and the creator of Ultraman. The original Godzilla would be a big innovation, as it would inspire similar works and methods that would spawn countless productions referred to as the 60s monster boom, which included Ultraman, which in itself would indirectly lead to the creation of Kamen Rider during the 70s superhero boom. Each of these IPs would work in their own unique ways from a production standpoint, and their cultural relevance would warrant them as pillars for the medium as they cover large and small scale film and television. Even during a point in time where interest in Tokusatsu and feature films was starting to fade in the 70s, television has seen a wide variety of these types of productions. Even when franchises like Godzilla and Kamen Rider would go on hiatuses that would bleed over into the early 80s, Super Sentai was still picking up the slack, Metal Heroes was pushing boundaries, and Tokusatsu would wound up inspiring lower-budget independent productions from Mamoru Oshii's The Red Spectacles to Shinya Tsukamoto's Tetsuo the Iron Man. Not to mention, the Godzilla series would eventually get rebooted, and Kamen Rider would see a revival with Kamen Rider Black. From this point on, it was evident that Tokusatsu was pretty much here to stay, though it wouldn't be until the 90s where Japanese film studios began toying around with relatively new digital technology. 1992's Godzilla vs. Mothra would be the first in the series to be filmed with digital equipment, featuring CGI by Bandai Namco, and leaving Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah to be the last fully analog Godzilla movie just a year prior. It's also worth noting that Mothra's emergence into her adult form also would have been digitized, but the artists were still very new to this tech, so it was swapped out for the final film. The following year's Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla would be the first in the series to use Dolby Digital 5.1. 1994's Godzilla vs. Space Godzilla would be the first to use digital compositing, and 1995's Godzilla vs. Destroya experimented with computer-generated renders of anti-tank helicopters and a Godzilla that would be used during the monster's iconic death scene, which at the time was impressive. Another film worthy of note would be 1999's Gamera 3: Revenge of Iris, where after two movies of some of the most spectacular model work and cinematography to ever be seen in these types of films, director Shusuke Kaneko would proceed to push their capabilities with CG. As a result, not all, but a very good handful of Gamera 3's special effects work would be digital, largely for scenes that would call for such use, as it would not only be difficult but also potentially dangerous and expensive to perform some of these feats with practical effects. To paint a better understanding, the dropkick from Godzilla vs. Megalon was executed due to the production having a small budget, a tight schedule, and with those in place, it is highly likely that director Jun Fukuda did not want to put an actor at risk. Hence why in this moment there's hardly any motion from the Godzilla suit itself. This could also explain why it's replayed a second time. But back to Gamera. While these CGI sequences may have not particularly aged the best depending on the viewer, they still convey an idea that's not necessarily possible with suitmation or as effective with miniatures. And since then, more Japanese films would proceed to have CG in some fashion. The Godzilla series would do this again with Godzilla 2000 and onward, and Shusuke Kaneko would have it be a major part of his Death Note duology. However, there is another potential factor when it comes to the push for CGI in Japanese productions, and part of it, based on speculation mind you, could be a potential lack of general interest in Tokusatsu. 2004 was proven to be a very troublesome year. The Godzilla series would go on hiatus after the disappointing reception and underperformance of Godzilla Final Wars. which was a celebration for the franchise's 50th anniversary, and it didn't help that the few Millennium films prior only made less and less money. SCRYE Productions would also scrap all future plans they had for the End project, which included the soft reboot film Ultraman the Next and its sequel series Ultraman Nexus, which would be cut prematurely after having to air at a later time slot and toy sponsor Bandai wanting to prioritize Gundam Seed Destiny instead. As for Toei, Kamen Rider Blade and Tokusatsu Sentai Deca Ranger would receive a mixed response. But even though Blade earned much less than the previous Heisei Rider entries in sales, it didn't perform too badly. And Deca Ranger was able to fare better in sales, likely due to how it was a more back-to-basic Sentai affair compared to how risky its predecessor Aba Ranger was, with the introduction of Abare Killer, whose character nearly got the show cancelled. And while it was 2 years later, the last Gamera feature film, Gamera the Brave, would unfortunately underperform as well, with an animated spin-off at Cartoon Network getting canned as a result. Other worthy mentions of these shortcomings include live-action adaptations of Kashan, Cutie Honey, and most infamously Devilman, which had garnered the reputation of being considered the worst Japanese film of all time. Yet, despite this, Tokusatsu persevered. Even though Kamen Rider Hibiki would perform lower than Blade the following year, things started picking back up with Kabuto, Den-O, and so forth. Obviously, Super Sentai just wasn't going away at this point, as its lowest performing season since 1997's Mega Ranger wouldn't be until Kira Major in 2020, for obvious reasons. And even though the End project was cancelled, it was still followed by Ultraman Max and Mebius before the Ultraman brand would see a gradual refresh with Ultra Galaxy and Ultraman Zero, which would help kickstart the new generation era of the Ultra series with Ultraman Giga. But even though this era has run well into the Reiwa era up to today, Tsuburaya was essentially living on borrowed time at this point, as they too were dealing with diminishing returns plus the infamous legal battle with SCRYE Productions that didn't end until 2018. Thus, Supro couldn't release a similar output to that of the Heisei era, given how they had a tendency to spend too much on shows that would put them in the red. And with these factors, including TV networks not wanting to invest in a full-core show due to labor and sponsor shortages within the industry, production costs would be affected, which does explain why they eventually cut the episode count in half for every season going forward, despite occasional efforts to push it. Not to mention, Ultraman Zero was created essentially to help maintain brand relevance and appeal. Toei doesn't have too much of an issue with this for Rider and Sentai, because they do own stock on TV Asahi, so they're still able to put together full 50 or so episode shows almost back to back. Not to mention they're also one of the biggest animation companies of all time. So while we have 3 ongoing major tokusatsu properties, they've been mostly regulated to television. And this brings me to a major point as to why tokusatsu isn't dying. Bandai has a major grip over these properties. Obviously, Bandai is a toy company, so in a way, these shows are seen as potential toy commercials in their eyes. So as long as these shows have at least some degree of being toyetic, there's a chance that those sales will help boost profit for both parties. Even with shows such as Avatar Sentai Dawn Brothers and Ultraman Blazar that didn't have too much to offer in regards to toy sales compared to prior entries, they still ended up being hits, but not entirely because of their toys. To say that Tokusatsu is nothing but a toy commercial is obviously a severe overgeneralization, as much like every other media, if you have the right people, they can tell stories that wound up resonating with viewers and can be fondly remembered for years to come. Plus, these companies, especially Tsuburaya, have been making an effort to push their brands for international appeal. But the real reason as to why Tokusatsu is still being utilized in these productions is that it is completely out of necessity. When producing a long-form production such as Ultraman or Kamen Rider, it is best to go with suitmation and practical stunt work, as opting for CG would actually make things more expensive for a production, and industry for that matter, that's already pretty limited. Granted, some of these shows have and still use CG to an extent, but it is always done to help enhance anything tangible or do something that can't quite be done practically. Such is the case with the effects work in Kamen Rider Kuga, or how King Gojo used LED sets to create gigantic set pieces. But we can't just look at what's popular to show that Tokusatsu is still thriving. Over the past couple of decades, one of Tokusatsu's strongest offerings is Keita Amemiya's Garo series, spawning in 2005 with sequels, spin-offs, and has last seen an entry with 2024's Heir to Steel Armor, all of which aired at a late time slot and was targeted for a more mature audience, which is a task that has definitely been difficult to succeed with for Tokusatsu. Meanwhile, many independent filmmakers are producing their own Tokusatsu films. Kiyotaka Taguchi went from being one of these creatives to a director for the Ultra series. Daisuke Sato is another who still collaborates with Tokusatsu veteran Keizo Murase. Granted, these projects, well, vary in quality to say the least, but it still shows that the spirit of what we view as traditional Tokusatsu is alive and well. But where's Godzilla in all of this? Well, when the Godzilla series was on hiatus, Godzilla vs. Hedorah director Yoshimitsu Banno pitched around a Godzilla movie suited for American audiences, which wouldn't fully materialize until legendary Warner Bros.' Godzilla movie in 2014. While the critical reception for this cinematic reboot was mixed with some positivity, Toho viewed it as an opportunity to finally bring back Godzilla for good, with a movie helmed by Evangelion's Hideaki Anno and Shinji Higuchi, who had previously collaborated on Giant God Warrior Appears in Tokyo, a tokusatsu short that in itself mixes CGI for visual enhancement. This would be the birth of what Higuchi would call hybrid, which, as the name would suggest, a combination of both forms of special effects. A year after Legendary's Godzilla, Higuchi would direct a live-action adaptation of the popular manga Attack on Titan, which proudly flaunted an ambitious mix of suitmation and miniatures with CG animation through hybrid. This feat was enough to convince Toho that there was a good possibility for Godzilla to be done in a similar fashion. However, when an animatronic model would be made for the titular monster in Shin Godzilla, Anno didn't quite like how it looked in test footage. So as a result, it was substituted for motion capture animation. So that's it, right? It's all CGI from here? Well, far from it actually. Even though Shin Godzilla would feature a computer-generated monster with plenty of computer-generated set pieces, Godzilla would be portrayed by theater actor Mansai Nomura for its motion capture, and miniature sets were still utilized for select destruction sequences. A similar tactic would be used later in 2022's Shin Ultraman, directed by Higuchi, where all of the animation for these giant characters were done via motion capture. Anno himself would even play Ultraman in a scene, and creatures such as Naranga used the actual Tsuburaya suits as a base for its motion capture. As for Anno's Shin Kamen Rider the following year, there is a hefty amount of on-location shooting and real stunt work on display, with CG being rather minimal, using it for enhancement like Attack on Titan. Though I'm just talking about a microcosm again, aren't I? Well, in that case, let's talk about Takashi Yamazaki. Yamazaki is considered one of Japan's most successful filmmakers working today. In his career, he would be inspired by the likes of George Lucas, Ridley Scott, and Steven Spielberg, whose special effects outings would prove influential for Japanese media as a whole, Tokusatsu included. One of the things that Yamazaki is known for, aside from his character writing and thematic storytelling, is his use of CG. In one of his films, Always Sunset on 3rd Street 2, there was a fully computer-generated Godzilla in a dream sequence, a sign for what's to come over a decade later. But what stands out about Yamazaki's visual effects work is that it's much higher quality compared to other big-budget pictures in Japan. There are several reasons for this. One of them being his experience in animation. Having directed films like Lupin III the First and Stand By Me Doraemon, it's very clear that Yamazaki understands how to frame certain subjects and tell a story in a way that elevates a picture to evoke a sense of artistry. In fact, Yamazaki would be one of many key players behind Shirogumi Incorporated, which specializes in animation visual effects. They would even be one of the many visual effects companies behind Shin Godzilla. Over the years, Yamazaki's prowess in directing special effects features is on full display in films such as Space Battleship Yamato, The Eternal Zero, and the Parasite duology. But as impressive as these technological feats may seem, like with Shin Godzilla and Shin Ultraman, there is an essence of practicality to them, within the set pieces, makeup, even miniatures and animatronics. This brings us to Godzilla Minus One. Having been filmed within a span of 4 months with post-production being worked on for well over a year, Yamazaki has shown the world that computer technology in Japan can not only rival that of a Hollywood production, but be just as sophisticated. Thus, the film would win an Academy Award for Best Visual Effects during the Oscars of 2024. Mind you, the film was competing against The Creator in this category, directed by former American Godzilla director Gareth Edwards, who has expressed high acclaim for Minus One and Yamazaki's work. But as we currently live within a digital age of special effects on both East and Western fronts of the world, the question begs once more, is Tokusatsu dying? While my short answer may be no, my true answer is that Tokusatsu is merely evolving. Let me put it to you this way using a recent example. The Planet of the Apes films aren't only widely celebrated for their message and significance to science fiction media, but have received immense praise for their ability to use makeup and special effects as a means to convey emotions that allow these performances to transcend their practicality and take on lives of their own. I mean, let's face it, when you think Roddy McDowell, you think Cornelius. Fast forward to when time came for Rise of the Planet of the Apes and onward, not only did computer-generated effects need to be adopted, but so did innovations that would allow for these ape effects to leave a similar impact the originals had. Hundreds and thousands of hard-working digital artists needed to create new ways for motion capture to truly feel alive. And it worked. In fact, it still does. Looking back, the new Planet of the Apes movies still hold up impressively well by today's standards, partly thanks to that real human element that's behind the facade in the final presentations. With all of this, from the beginnings of digital implementation to this modern push in mind, Tokusatsu is doing exactly this. Granted, it's not quite on the same level as apes, but it's the same idea and process. Obviously, a budget can only take you so far, but when used wisely, these special effects can leave a profound impact on both viewers and the industry. Hence, this is why special effects cinema has endured for so long. We've come a long way from King Kong, or more appropriately, the original Godzilla. While taste may be subjective, what we have now is a testament to the progression of the art form itself, and it's not going away anytime soon. Anyway, thank you all for watching, big shout out to my channel members, and if y'all like what you see, you can be one of the many generous people who support me on Patreon, where you can get early access to videos and exclusive content. Also want to give a big thanks to my buddies Sean and Lily for providing pointers on the research for this piece, and another big thanks to the Ultraland Discord server for all the Ultraman stuff. Y'all know who you are. Really appreciate it, and other than that, feel free to like, share, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff, and I'll see you guys next time. Take care, everyone.